Morning Village Church. Gets fuller every time I come here. Wonderful problem to have, but it's Adam's problem. That's why it's wonderful. So a number of years ago, I knew a pastor who was spotted coming out the side door of the Adult World building in Port Elizabeth. And my first thought was similar to the one that's currently running through your mind. Turns out that the church had offices on the second story of this building in town. And Adult World had moved in and bought out the lower levels and taken it over. And so he was literally exiting the church office. And the point is that something absolutely harmless can actually be harmful. Think of the ramifications for his reputation when that rumor starts to do the rounds. I didn't even know him all that well, and I heard the rumor. Think of the implications for members in his church who think, well, if my pastor can go there, or people leaving the church. So something inherently harmless can sometimes be damaging to others. We encounter something of that principle in 1 Corinthians 8, which we're going to look at this morning. One of the great truths of the gospel is that Jesus has set us free. He set us free from bondage to the law. He has set us free from the fear of death. He has set us free from the dominion of darkness. He has set us free from many of the things that have previously held us captive. And that's a beautiful truth. Now, some of the Christians in the church in Corinth was the third largest city in the Roman world and was a hive of debauchery. It was probably the Las Vegas of the Roman Empire. And there are a group of Christians in the church in Corinth who have come to understand a beautiful and glorious dimension of this reality that Jesus had set them free. They had come to understand that they had been set free from the fear and obligation to the idols they grew up worshiping all their lives, revering and fearing. And with that freedom, with that realization came a very enjoyable freedom for them. You see, in the ancient world, any meat that you could buy in the market had probably been sacrificed at an ancient temple. It had been part of some kind of ritual. The animal had been sacrificed, much like the French chickens were sacrificed on the Springbok altar last night. And then whatever was left over was taken to the market. And you would buy it from the market. Now for Jews and many Christians, eating that meat was taboo because it was associated with idolatry and idol worship. So the Jews had strict regulations about not eating any meat that had been sacrificed to idols, and these were taken over by many of the early Christian congregations. But we have this group of Christians in Corinth who have come to this glorious new insight. The idols don't exist. There's only one God. And hey, if the idols don't exist, we can eat that biltong. It's just good food. It's not contaminated, it's not demon-possessed, it's just meat that has been sacrificed to something that doesn't exist. And so against that background, they write to Paul, because this was not a shared understanding in the church in Corinth. So they write to Paul, and they essentially champion this new vision that they've had of what they are free to do and ask for his blessing, and we have his answer. Starts in 1 Corinthians 10 and goes all the way, 8 and goes all the way to 1 Corinthians 10, but we're only going to look at chapter 8 today. What he's essentially dealing with here is how should mature Christians behave on issues on which various believers would disagree, disputed matters. You know, there are some things that God has not revealed with crystal clarity. He hasn't told us exactly what to do on every ethical question, every decision of wisdom. it's happening less and less often, but every now and again I bump into someone who still thinks it's okay to support Lewis Hamilton. It's not really sin, it's just stupidity, but God hasn't told us with sufficient clarity that there aren't people who still didn't get the memo. One day, Jonesy, one day. But there are many disputed items in the church. What might some of them be? Alcohol is a famous one, and we might circle back to that later, time permitting. But what about other things? Participating in certain family traditions and rituals. What about cosmetic surgery? What about joining unions and participating in strikes? Depending on whether you're an employer or an employee, you might sit on radically opposite sides of that fence as a justice issue. Where's God on that? How about finding tax loopholes? As believers, should we obey the spirit of the law or the letter of the law? Homeschooling might be another one, or secular schooling. Cultural festivals, church discipline and restoration. Using herbal medicines, taking vaccines, or how we use things like artificial intelligence, some of the new technologies that have arisen. We don't always have a clear, unmistakable guideline from the Lord that says, here's the line. I want all Christians to be on that side and none on this side. Sometimes things are less clear than that. So Paul engages their question, and he essentially says to them, when you're trying to make a decision on something that's a disputed issue, you've got two compasses that you can use to chart your course. One is knowledge, and the other is love. And he's going to champion that the knowledge compass is limited and flawed. And the thing that should shape our decision-making on disputed issues is not knowledge, but love. So let's see how he unpacks that. He begins by saying that you must choose your compass, knowledge or love. And it's not an equal choice. We're in 1 Corinthians 8, verses 1 to 3. He says, now concerning food sacrificed to idols. The backstory here is that the Corinthian church has written a letter to Paul, and there were all kinds of factions and struggles and squabbles going on in the church. But they've written a letter to Paul, and in the second half of 1 Corinthians, he's responding to the hot potato issues that they've raised in their letter. And every time he moves to a new topic, you'll find the phrase, now concerning. So in 7 verse 1, we've got now concerning the things you wrote about. In 7:25, now concerning virgins. In 8 verse 1, our passage, now concerning food sacrificed to idols. In 12 verse 1, now concerning spiritual gifts or spirituality. In 16 verse 1, now concerning the offering for the saints. So each time he moves to another one of the issues that they've raised, he signals that he's responding to their argument or their question. And the implication here is they've written to him and they've asked him a question. But it's a loaded question. They're pretty sure they're right. I was told when teaching, never ask a question to which you don't know the answer. Dangerous. They wanted him to endorse their viewpoint. What was the question? It might have gone something like this. We're kind of listening to one half of a conversation here. But the question might have been something like this. Hey, Paul, we've just realized something amazing. Idols don't exist. There's only one God. And this is so cool because it means we can eat the biltong. We can enjoy the food that was sacrificed to them because it's not dangerous for us. Don't you agree, buddy? Well, he half agrees. He agrees with their conclusion regarding the idols. But he disagrees with the way that they choose to live out that freedom. So he continues. He says, we know that we all have knowledge. And he uses this language, we know, to group himself with the people who've had this new insight. He has the same insight, but a different response to it. Then notice how he contrasts and compares knowledge and love as the two things that you can use for making your life choices here. He says, knowledge makes one conceited, but love edifies people. I prefer the NIV on this one. It says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Then back to knowledge. If anyone thinks he knows anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by him. You see the rhythm? Knowledge, love, knowledge, love. And the way that he presents this as the framework, the rubric, the compass, if you wish, for making your choice on unclear issues, is to uphold the fact that knowledge is more dangerous and love is the preferred compass or framework. He tells us two things about each of them. Firstly, regarding knowledge, he makes the point that when we make our choices based on our knowledge, we are living and acting selfishly. When I'm using knowledge to decide that I'm free to do something, I know the idol doesn't exist, so I'm free to eat meat that's been sacrificed to it. Who am I thinking about? I'm only thinking about me, right? My knowledge, my rights, my insight, my freedom, my enjoyment. So the knowledge is inherently conceited and selfish. By contrast, when love drives the decision, who am I thinking about? The other person, the not me. I'm thinking about you. What's good for you? How's this going to impact those around me? What impact will it have on fellow believers in the church or on the witness of the gospel? So the idea is one looks inward and the other one looks outward. Where's God looking? What's God's yardstick for the commands that he gives? If he was to chart a course of action, would he be more concerned about our individual freedoms or the well-being of his people as a whole? Secondly, he tells us love is partial. In 1 Corinthians 13, he'll say that explicitly. He'll say we know in part in the midst of the love chapter. We know in part, we prophesy in part. But he makes the same idea here. He says, if anyone thinks they know, they should pause and remember that they don't yet know as they ought to know. What is the point, friends? The point is that even when I'm dead certain that I know something, I must leave room for the fact that I'm a limited human being and I might not know the whole truth. I personally find that very hard to imagine, but apparently it's true. We were having this debate. I was having a debate with a colleague at SATS. We've been working through this passage. And we got onto the question of, do ancestors exist? Now, of course, they existed. And they exist as gods, as spirit beings that are eternal. But do ancestors exist as spiritual agents that move among us and have the power to bless or curse? The power to prosper or punish? Well, my friend is a committed believer, and I declared definitively ancestors do not exist. There's no God but one. And I'm absolutely certain that's true. And my discussion partner is absolutely certain that ancestors exist. That they become spirit beings who are part of the fallen spirit world. And he's absolutely sure that he's right. Now, of course, I'm right. It was self-evident to me that I was right. My dad used to like to say, he once thought he was wrong, but he was mistaken. So here's the thing. We're both absolutely convinced that we have the Bible right on this issue. One of us is absolutely not right. Right? The car can't be blue and green at the same time if it's only painted one color. But if we think we know, we should leave room for the possibility that what we are sure we know is right, we may not have the whole truth. Our knowledge may be wrong. And then he makes the balancing point that's a bit hard to explain. He says, if anyone loves God, he's known by God. And there's lots of interpretive challenges with the verse that we're not going to dig into. But I think the sense might anchor to something Jesus said in Matthew 6. Jesus said, if you're going to give alms, going to give charity, don't do it for everyone to see you giving generously. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And then your Father in heaven, who sees what you do in secret, will reward you openly. And when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites who like to stand on the street corners and pray long-winded, spiritual-sounding prayers. Go into your closet and pray to your Father in private, because your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you openly. And when you fast, don't be like the hypocrites who disfigure their faces. This happens naturally with the process of aging, but don't speed it up in order to appear more spiritual so that people know you're fasting. Rather, fast with nobody knowing, because your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you openly. The point is that when we do things that are driven by love for God and His people, even if no one else knows that we're paying a price to do them, the Father knows. And He notices. And He rewards openly. When we act not based on our rights and freedoms, but based on love for God's people, our Father knows and sees and will reward us openly. So the right compass to use on issues where Christians would differ is not primarily knowledge, but primarily love. Now, for the rest of our chapter, he's going to unpack those two compasses, and he's going to start with knowledge. From verse 4 to verse 12, just one verse from the end, is all about the limitations of relying on what we know to shape our conduct. And then right at the end, he'll come to love. So the warning is this: we must be cautious of the knowledge compass. Sacrificial love, rather than superior knowledge, is to guide our behavior on the issues on which we, as even a body here, would disagree and take different views. And he unpacks that in two ways. Firstly, he tells us that we do not all have the same knowledge. Anyone who's been married knows this. We do not all have the same knowledge. Paul and the Corinthians had a certain understanding of what idols were and were not, and therefore what the implications might be of eating meat that had been dedicated to them in some kind of ceremony. Others in the Corinthian church did not have the same knowledge or understanding. Now, it seems to me that we're talking about something that is pretty basic Christianity. There is no God but one. That's pretty basic Christianity. And yet, the warning here is, in any group of God's people, a group this size, we are all over the map in terms of how we understand God and His requirements and the spirit world. Even on things you might think are obvious, they may not be equally obvious to everyone. So verse 4, he says, therefore, concerning the eating of food sacrificed to idols, we know. Who's the we? Paul and the Corinthians who know. Not all Christians. The we is Paul and the in-group who wrote him the letter. With me? We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. Does that sound like Christianity 101? There's no God but one? That the idol isn't real as a God? As an agent to fear? Now, obviously, when he says the idol is nothing in the world, he's not saying idols don't exist at all. You could go into almost any household in Corinth and you would find several of them. So the idols existed. He's not denying that. What he's denying is that the idols represent real gods or real spiritual agents who can bless or curse, who can punish or prosper you or protect you, that they should be feared in some way. And that therefore, if something has been dedicated to them in a ceremony, you should be careful of touching it because you might be contaminated by associating with a false god. That's what he means. So he says in verse 5, for even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords. Are there many gods? Are there many lords? Near. I'm so glad you asked, by the way. Looks like a confusing question. So it depends on whether we're talking about ultimate reality, where there's one creator, right? Or whether we're talking about the human experience. If you travel around the world, you'll find people worshiping Krishna and Allah and Oprah and all kinds of strange deities. Yet for us, there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for him. And one Lord, Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist for him. We've got to be so careful reading this in our modern world where there's a temptation to think that my right and your right can be completely unrelated. My reality and your reality can be completely unrelated. Paul is not for one moment suggesting that there are really many different creators, many different gods. He's just acknowledging that people around the world believe in and worship all kinds of deities, even though there's only one true creator, the Father, from whom are all things, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, by whom are all things. So an idol is nothing, and there is no God but one. Basic Christianity, right? If we took a poll of Village Church, everyone would agree. If we were the first century Corinthian church, we would all be on the same page on this. Probably not. Verse 7. However, not all people have this knowledge. What is this knowledge? An idol is nothing in the world. There's no God but one, right? Not all people have this knowledge. Which all people is he talking about? Not all people out there. He's talking about the whole church in Corinth, the very community from which they had approached him to say, hey, Paul, we've got a revelation going on here. In the Corinthian church, the community of God's people do not agree on that thing. And he says, however, not all people, meaning not all of our people, have this knowledge. Some, being accustomed to the idol, until now, eat food as if it was sacrificed to the idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. So what's going on here? They grew up with the rituals and the ceremonies and the veneration. And no doubt they had had spiritual experiences that had confirmed to them that the power of these idols are real. The stories went through the community of people who had been bewitched, people who had been cursed, people who had been prospered because of the veneration that was practiced as they grew up. They were convinced the spirituality they knew was real. And when they came to Christ, it didn't automatically flick a switch where everything they grew up believing suddenly was unlocked and switched. So he says, but some of our people, being accustomed to the idol until now, when they eat that food that was dedicated to the idol, they believe they are participating in something that venerates other gods. And their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Your conscience is your individual moral compass that tells you what's right and what's wrong. And when you step over the line of what your conscience believes to be good or bad, you should and will feel guilt. But here's the thing. Your conscience only knows what it's been taught. It is taught and conditioned by everything you've been exposed to, believed, grown up, experienced, etc. We do not all have the same conscience. A conscience is like a little app that's been programmed by all our experiences. And so the Bible speaks of 3 types of consciences. The Corinthians are mentioned as having a weak conscience. A weak conscience is one that is convinced that things that are not condemned by God are wrong. So if I believe it's a sin to drink coffee and I drink coffee, will I feel guilty? Yes. Right? Because I've sinned against my conscience. That's a weak conscience. The opposite extreme is a seared conscience, mentioned in Scripture. Seared conscience is if I believe something is fine, but God says it's wrong. I can do it and feel no guilt. Because my consciousness isn't shaped by His word and His will. Psychopaths fall in that category. Hitler would be a good example, but you can be a less extreme example than Hitler. One of the most widespread ones today would be the whole sexual revolution, telling us that various practices that God said are wrong are not wrong. Right? So if you believe that and you practice what God said is wrong, but you don't believe God said it, do you feel guilty? No. You don't feel guilty, but you are guilty. You get the difference? I can be guilty without feeling guilt. Or I can feel guilt without being guilty. And then there's a good conscience, which is one that's calibrated according to God's commands. And it experiences real guilt. We should feel guilty when we break God's commands. We should not feel guilty when we don't. So that leads us to the second reason knowledge is problematic here. That is that we do not all have the same freedom. We do not all have the same knowledge, therefore we do not all have the same freedom. The connection is they realized the idol doesn't exist, therefore eating food that was dedicated to the idol is harmless. It's just good food, because the idol's not real. So their knowledge gave them a kind of freedom, right? But if somebody believes the idol is real, they don't have the same freedom. We don't all have the same freedom because we don't all have the same knowledge. I know that God supports Max Verstappen. But not everyone has this knowledge. So you don't all have the same freedom as me. Bad example, sorry. Couldn't resist. So here's how Paul unpacks it. He says in verse 8, "Now if food will not bring us close to God, we are neither worse if we do not eat, nor better if we do eat." Think how radical that statement is, coming from a devoted Jew, for whom what you eat is directly related to how close you are to God. Jewish food laws were central to their concept of God's approval, and still are. But Paul has realized that food is irrelevant to his relationship with God. He's neither better if he eats something, nor worse if he doesn't. Now, he and the Corinthians both agree on that, at least the group that want his support. But they have opposite responses to it. The Corinthians are saying, the food does us no harm, so we should eat, drink, and be merry because it's lekker. That biltong that was sacrificed to, very nice. Paul says, eating that biltong isn't going to make me any closer to God or any better. Oh, and by the way, it might cause someone else to stumble. There's the problem. Not everyone in the church had the same freedom. So Paul says this in verse 9. He says, "But take care that this freedom of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak." What does he mean? He unpacks it in the next few verses. He says, "For if someone sees you, the one who has knowledge, dining at an idol's temple. You who know the idol isn't real, right? Sees you dining at an idol's temple. Will his conscience, if he is weak, not be strengthened to eat things that have been sacrificed to idols? So if someone thinks Justin is a spiritual giant and they see Justin doing something, will they not think, well, if he can do it, then I can do it? But if we don't have the same knowledge and we don't have the same freedom, then copying what he does may not be so good for you. For through your knowledge, the one who is weak is ruined, the brother or sister for whose sake Christ died. And so by sinning against the brothers and sisters and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. In other words, my dear friends, in an ideal world, you're right. You could eat the food sacrificed to the idols. It won't do you any harm. But you're part of a church community where not everyone understands that. And if you do it, others are going to do it. And if others do it, their conscience is going to be ruined. And so while it's harmless for you to eat the meat, it's harmful to our church if others see you and copy you. It's the problem with the knowledge compass, friends. Your knowledge may give you freedom to do something without guilt. But if others imitate you without having the same understanding, they may be guilty and be condemned. And therefore, Paul would say, since there's no benefit whatsoever in eating or not eating, he makes his choice. And so he ends by saying we should be champions of the love compass. Verse 13. Now you can read 1 Corinthians 8 by just reading 2 verses. If you just read verse 1, you get the question. Paul, concerning food sacrificed to idols, we can enjoy it, right? That's the question. Then his whole unpacking culminates in one statement in verse 13 where he says, therefore, if food causes my brother to sin, I will never eat meat again. Alex? Never. Never. So that I will not cause my brother to sin. The basic idea is clear. Eating or not eating the meat, Paul knows, is irrelevant spiritually. He and they are not going to be better believers if they eat that meat. But as long as it's a contentious, divisive issue that can cause others in their community to sin, God's love demands that they give up personal freedoms and rights for the good of the whole community of God. How do we navigate disputed issues on which Christians would disagree? Love is much more important consideration than our knowledge, our understanding of the issue. So what are some of the hot potato issues these days? Alcohol remains a hot potato one in the church, right? Our church would be all over the map on what your convictions are about whether Christians can drink alcohol. That's problematic in gatherings of Christian believers, especially if they come from different churches and different places and cultures and communities. As a seminary, we had a gathering a couple of years ago, and our staff had flown in from all over the country and the world, and one of our leaders invited group of people to her home, and she had no problem with leaving some wine and other beverages out. Some of our African brothers come from other countries were deeply confused and offended. I mean, how can you do this? And there was a young man present, early 20s, who managed to get himself intoxicated at this gathering of Christian leaders, teachers. And in his intoxicated state, he did some rather foolish things that he shouldn't have done. Meaning we had to release him from our seminary staff. But why? did the leader who organized that gathering not have enough sense to know that the freedom she felt in her own home needed to be curbed for the sake of the gathering of a community that would be all over the map on that thing? And not knowing if there's anyone there who's going to be weak and vulnerable on that issue. She defended her knowledge. She should have acted with a different compass. What we post on social media often falls into this category. Not everything you share is going to be helpful. When the Charlie Kirk thing broke, I immediately realized that we live in a context, and I lead a ministry in which he is celebrated by some as the cousin to the martyr Stephen in the book of Acts, and to others as the brother of Beelzebul. That we are a polarized community on whether this is a person to be celebrated and honored or somebody whose death should be celebrated and honored. And I'm far enough away from America not to imagine that I have the full answer. And nothing good can come out of taking sides in our SATS community. Why polarize our people simply because I want to express a partisan view, knowing that it's a divisive issue for our community? And we could mention others: politics, voting, participating in certain ceremonies as Africans. You might, as an African convert, you grew up in African traditional religion and has come to understand that there's no God but one, you might be able to freely participate in something knowing that it's harmless to you. The extra question to ask is, will my participation be harmful to somebody else? Maybe a younger brother or sister in Christ. So friends, in matters not clearly commanded or forbidden by Scripture, mature believers must let love, not individual liberty, be their compass. The question is not, what am I permitted to do? The question is, what is it beneficial for me to do? To Christ's name, for the good of His people, and for the witness of the gospel. The Lord bless you. Thank you.